What is up, YouTube? Today I bring you another edition of MatchUP Close. This is a situation that actually came up on stream today, earlier today. I'm gonna link the actual stream in the description below. So if you want to see like the entire playthrough of this match, you can do so right there. But what I'm going to talk about today is the Infect matchup. Infect is effective one of Amulet's absolute worst matchups. The matchup is actually pretty bad. In fact, this is game 3 right here. And we lost game 2 because we were on the draw. My opponent killed me on turn 2. So the matchup is pretty bad for us. But here we are with Pandan Wine's challenge winning deck list from this past weekend. That's not going to matter that much, but still, I'm going to link to the deck list in the description, if so you can check it out and stuff. But yeah, so a very interesting situation came up on stream, so I decided to make another edition of MatchUP Close to kind of analyze this situation, why I did what I did, and how it ended up working out, right? So, as I said earlier, this is game 3. We're playing against Infect, and the sideboarding goes as follows. I cut Radiant Fountain, Field of the Dead, 2 copies of Explore, Ancient Steerings, 1 copy of Pact of Negation, and 1 copy of Summoner's Pact. Those are the cards that I took out. The cards that I brought in are going to be Ghost Squatter, Nature's Claim, Melara Silvok Outcast, 2 copies of Dismember, 1 copy of Walking Ballista, and 1 copy of Engineered Explosives. So this is how our deck looks like right now. This is the opening hand that we are dealt. And I think this is a very reluctant keep, but basically I need this once upon a time to resolve, and I needed to find me a green source. If I manage to find a green source, then we actually might be in a solid spot. We already have a Primeval Titan. You're going to see that I saboted out 1 of my Summoner's Pacts. The reason for this is that it's very hard for like your Infect opponent to answer the first Titan, so you always want to draw exactly one copy of Primeval Titan. So instead of having 11 copies, I am very comfortable having only access to 10, because the very first thing that we're going to try to make sure that happens is we need to survive. Okay, we need to not die, because as I was saying earlier, Infect is a combo deck that is actually much faster than we are and more consistent at doing the combo thing that we are. So we have to actually slow down and make sure that we can interact with what our opponent's doing while being able to catch up on mana and board, right? It's important for us to stay ahead on board. We're actually going to go over this right now in this video. So we're dealt with this 7. I reluctantly keep, and I am of course going to once upon a time first of all, and my opponent makes they make this place which makes no sense. Like, you always want to make sure that you once upon a time when it gives you the most information and it gives your opponent the least amount of information. So when I once upon a time in my main phase is because I'm actually actively looking for something. For my opponent to once upon a time before they know their draw step is a strict mistake. So that is something that, as a once upon a time player, if you're playing Amulet, you need to be aware of. You like once upon a time in response to your opponent's card it makes no sense. You always want to once upon a time on your main phase after your draw step at least. Unless you're playing around like Force of Negation, which this is game 3 and my opponent knows that I don't have Force of Negation, so it's whatever. So my opponent reveals an Ink Moth Nexus. This is an evasive threat, but we kind of have it covered, so I'm not too worried yet. So we get to resolve our own copy of Once Upon a Time, and we're met with these options. I consider. I don't think it's actually very close to being considered. I don't think that we can afford to take anything that is not this basic forest. Basic forest will allow me to, first of all, play Sacred Tribe Scout on 1, and it's also going to allow me to Steerings on turn 2, while still holding up Ghost Squatter as a form of interaction. So I definitely want to take the green source that is also untapped. Gruul Turf, of course, make sure that I hit more land drops overall, right? Because it's going to be a bounce land, which creates card advantage. But I think that at this point, like, we're on the play, we need to try to get ahead on try to get ahead on board. Basically, I want to have stuff on board, and I want to start getting ahead on land drops thanks to Sacred Tribe Scout. I think that I need to get this, and I need to get a little bit lucky by finding more lands off the top of the deck. Fortunately, we have access to both steerings and Once Upon a Time, so we are likely to find another bounce land in the top. But I think that we need to get the basic forest here. So we're gonna pick the basic forest, then we're gonna play our Sakura Drive Scout, and we're gonna pass the turn. My opponent is gonna play Wooded Foothills, and then they're gonna ship the turn back to us. At this point, I'm pretty happy because my opponent doesn't have a Glycerin Elf in play. However, I am a little bit worried that they might be holding up a Blighted Agent, which is the most relevant card, right? Because it's harder for us to kill, and we can't chump block it with Sakura Drive Scouts and Colony Gardens and stuff. So I'm going to choose to go for Ancient Steerings first. One thing to consider there is the fact that maybe I could have played out the Gemstone Mine in order to play around my opponent on Spell Pierce, but I already have a Once Upon a Time, so I'm not too worried if my opponent Spell Pierces my Ancient Steerings. I'm still looking to find a bounce land anyway. Maybe I should have just done it just because it's a little bit cleaner, but I like to give my opponent less information. And my opponent does not Spell Pierce the Ancient Steerings. So here I actually have a very relevant decision, like whether do I take the Walking Ballista or the Sandhome Fortress of the Legion. I end up going for the Ballista because I think that this matchup is bad enough that we are going to need to get a little bit lucky anyways if we're going to win. And Walking Ballista actually does a great job at helping me catch up and being able to interact with my opponent's threats. So I'm going to be a little bit greedy, bottom the land. If that had been a bounce land, I would have actually picked the bounce land. But since Sandhome is like such a bad land anyway for us, I think that the upside of Ballista is just significantly higher. So because of this, I'm going to play out the Tribe Scout and I'm going to try to hold up the Ghost Quarter. There's no need for me to play it yet. I was expecting something like a Dismember or whatever, but my opponent just fetches for a tapped Breeding Pool. Then they untap and they play an Inkmoth Nexus. Now that they do this, I don't think that I want to be... basically, I need that I'm going to be needing to make my land drops here. So I think that I would have liked to be able to hold up the Ghost Quarter, but at this point, I feel like I want to make sure that I am ahead on board and that I'm able to like maximize the value that I get from my cards. So I think that I need to expose the Ghost Quarter, unfortunately, and show my opponent that I have an answer for the Inkmoth Nexus. Here we untap, and I go for the main phase Once Upon a Time, holding up Ghost Quarter. Obviously, I want to make sure that my opponent knows that I have interaction. This time around, actually, my opponent does Spell Pierce my Once Upon a Time, which I find a little bit interesting. But yeah, like because if they Spell Pierce the Ancient Steerings, if they didn't Spell Pierce the Ancient Steerings, I don't know why they would Spell Pierce the Once Upon a Time here. But maybe they're like more afraid, like maybe they think that I'm missing a prime time or something, and that's why they wanna Spell Pierce that one instead of the other one. I don't know. Question is, my opponent Spell Pierces here, and yeah, we just let it resolve because our land is tapped. Here, I'm not interested in attacking. I think that threatening having access to like more pieces of interaction is more relevant than this. So we're gonna pass the turn back to my opponent. They untap, they play one land, they activate Inkmoth Nexus, and they are going to attack for 1. I, of course, don't do anything. Of course, I don't want to be the first one to react because my opponent might use like a Vines of Vastwood or Blossom in defense in order to protect their Inkmoth Nexus from my Ghost Quarter activation. And here they use a Mutagenic Growth, which again, I'm okay. Like, I'm fine taking 3. I'm fine taking 3. Like, my opponent... The good thing about my opponent having Inkmoth Nexus as a threat is that, first of all, is the easier threat that they have for us to interact, is the easier threat for us to interact with. And second of all, I also think that this is the most mana intensive threat because it costs my opponent at least 2 mana to get going. Like, they need to activate the Inkmoth and they also need to tap it to attack. So that's 2 mana that my opponent is not going to be using to protect their threats. So definitely when your Infect opponent has an Inkmoth, you are like the happiest that you can be, basically. So here we're going to go to our end step. Again, last turn I did not attack with the scouts because I don't think that the damage is relevant. Like, we are either going to resolve the Titan and win, or we're going to not find our lands and we're going to die anyway. So like, I think that bluffing, having some kind of land interaction is going to be more relevant. And not giving my opponent information. Again, we're trying to play the information war as well. So on my end step, of course, I'm going to play out the tapped land. This will allow me to ballista for a larger amount. Here we draw an Amulet, and I think this is actually a very interesting spot right here. I choose to go with the Walking Ballista, hiding the fact that I have access to an Amulet here. Again, I don't want to interact with my opponent's Inkmoth yet. And it's something that actually people in my chat were suggesting, like, why didn't you kill the Inkmoth on their main phase? And this is true. Like, this is actually true. If I were to Ghost Quarter my opponent's Inkmoth right here, my opponent is not going to be able to protect it. However, a couple of things come attached to this that we need to realize, and this is why I think it's important to be patient in this matchup when we're in a situation like this. Number one, we are missing land drops. We are, I mean, I don't need to tell you, we're a very mana hungry deck, right? So we're missing land drops, and I definitely do not want to use a Ghost Quarter to kill my opponent's Inkmoth, because it keeps my opponent even on mana. If they have a second Inkmoth, they know that it's safe to good for it. It's definitely very plausible for my opponent to have a second Inkmoth in hand that they are just sandbagging and waiting until, again, trying to hold off the information from me, which I think is correct, by the way. And second of all, like, you will see even that I could have played a Walking Ballista for 2 right here, but what this would have done is it would have cost me my Gemstone Mine. That's one of my 4 total lands, and it's actually going to mean that I'm not going to have Ghost Quarter as a way to interact with my opponent's Inkmoth Nexus. Also, here, by playing the Ballista for 1, I am playing around a card like Nature's Claim, Dismember. Any of those cards can answer the Ballista, and if I had tapped out, then my opponent can like fetch shock or whatever, just normal fetch, and like dismember my Walking Ballista. I'm going to basically ping them twice. They're going to untap and kill me with this very Inkmoth. So by playing the Ballista only for 1 and keeping the Ghost Quarter up, I basically guarantee that it's going to cost my opponent more mana if they want to go for the kill, right? They need to use the Nature's Claim or the removal spell on the Ballista right now, and then they will need to actually use mana on their turn if they want to pump and kill me. So we pass the turn. My opponent fetches at the end step. They get a tap Breeding Pool, and then they untap. So now they play a land, and we move on to the next turn. My opponent moves to combat after activating the Inkmoth, and then they're going to attack me. Here we find ourselves in the same situation. My opponent is attacking for 1. Yeah, we're at 3 poison. So my opponent needs to deal 7 damage to me before they can win this game. Again, we're faced with the same situation, right? I could use the Walking Ballista here to like get the party started. Basically, my opponent can use a pump spell to protect it. Then I can go Quarter. Then they use like some kind of hexproof effect in order to protect their Inkmoth Nexus. So I'm definitely not interested in any of that. I want my opponent to like basically waste some cards before we actually start doing anything. And at this point, every turn that goes by and I have a Ballista in play, this Ballista continues growing like a larger and larger threat, and eventually is going to be able to take over whatever my opponent is trying to do over there, especially if they don't have an answer to it. So my opponent attacks, I pass priority. I wait for my opponent to do anything. They choose to not do anything. Cool. I take my poison. This is perfectly okay for us. My opponent simply passes the turn. End of turn, I'm going to do nothing. Every turn that goes by from now on, as long as my opponent does not answer my Ballista, we're going to be further and further and further ahead. So there's no need for me to use my Ballista. I could again go for the Inkmoth kill, but my opponent can use their mana. I'm trying to, the same way that I'm bottlenecked on mana, I'm trying to make sure that my opponent also is bottlenecked on mana as well. Because this is the way that I can win this game. I basically just don't allow my opponent to cast their cards by playing in this fashion. So we go to the end step, and then we draw the best possible draw. Any kind of bounce land would have been the best possible draw for us here. Whether because it's going to help us cast Titan this turn, or whether it's because it's going to allow us to reset gemstone mine and then go for it on the following turn. So here we're going to play our Amulet. Note that I didn't expose my Amulet on the previous turn. I didn't give my opponent this information. If they wanted to, basically because the cost was too high, because I would have needed to either lose one of my lands or actually tap my Ghost Quarter, which would have led me with one layer of protection less against Inkmoth. And because it also now means that my opponent that I don't need to show my opponent what is going to happen on the next turn, basically. So here I actually do play the Amulet, and I ask my opponent, do you have the Nature's Claim or the Force of Vigor? I play my land and wait to see what happens. Because this is the key point, right? At this moment, my opponent, I can actually start extracting value. Even if my opponent answers my Amulet at this point, the second that this Rod Farm actually untapped, it means that I have the potential to have Titan mana. So I float my mana, and I'm going to, again, bounce the Golgari Rod Farm. At this point, I basically have guaranteed Primeval Titan mana because I can use this Tribe Scout, and if this Golgari Rod Farm comes into play, I'm going to get a guaranteed untap trigger from the Amulet, which is going to mean that I'm going to have enough mana to cast my Primeval Titan. My opponent can still Nature's Claim my Amulet or something, or yeah, basically Nature's Claim my Amulet or Force of Vigor it, but then I can use my second Scout to guarantee that I get 2 mana from this Golgari Rod Farm in response to that. So at this point, I'm assuming that my opponent has no interaction for the Amulet, and because I don't think that Infect plays Disdainful Stroke, maybe they play one copy if at all, but I don't think that, like, usually this kind of big mana decks are very good for Infect, so I think that they don't even play Disdainful Stroke to begin with. It's very rare to see a list with Disdainful Stroke. The counter magic of choice is cards like Spell Pierce, which can be cast off as a single mana, Mystical Dispute, and Ceremonious Rejection, because they really struggle with Chalice, and none of those Disdainful Stroke doesn't answer that card, which is like the main problematic one for Infect. So this is why I'm not going to play around Disdainful Stroke. Simply, I'm going to cast my Primeval Titan here. Alternatively, I could have put multiple counters on the Walking Ballista. This play, I don't think it's very good. First of all, because it doesn't really progress my own game plan. It basically only works in order to stop my opponent's game plan. But also because at this point, like, my opponent can still top deck a removal spell for the Walking Ballista. They use the removal spell on their main phase, then they can activate the Inkmoth and continue attacking. So I don't think that there's any need for me to go all in on this Walking Ballista. So I'm just going to play out my Primeval Titan. It does resolve as expected, and because I don't think my opponent can do very much, we're going to go for the haste option. Note one very important thing though. If my opponent were to have Vines of Vastwood, they could actually counter my Slayer's Stronghold activation. However, if they do that, I think that that's an outcome that I'm actually quite happy with. That's one less protection spell for my opponent's Inkmoth Nexus to for one less protection spell that can protect my opponent's Inkmoth Nexus. That it's the only way that my opponent kills me at this point. So that's why I chose to go for this line right here. I go for the haste line, it resolves. At this point, I'm feeling very, very good about my situation. Again, if my opponent had a Dismember, they would have already used it with either the Sacred Tribe Scapt or the Walking Ballista. So I'm not playing around like double Dismember or Dismember plus Dry Diver. I don't think that that's something that I should consider. So I attack with the Primeval Titan. They can still have a Dry Diver, so that's why I don't think that it's worth it to attack with the Walking Ballista. Again, we're in a situation where we're trying to figure out how do we not lose, right? And again, the only way that I lose right here is if I go for double strike, right? I attempt to double strike my opponent, my Primeval Titan. They Vines of Vast with it, and then I am tapped out and I don't have interaction for my opponent's Inkmoth, and I die this way. So I'm trying to play it extremely cautious because I'm so far ahead that at this point, that is the only question that I'm asking myself. Like, how do I lose this game? My opponent fetches, and then they, for whatever reason, I don't know why they fetch there, and then they pass. Here I choose to go with Vesuva plus a bounce land. The reason for this is because Ghost Quarter allows me to again have another layer of interaction, and at this point the gemstone mine doesn't matter. So with Simic Growth plus Forest plus gemstone mine, I'm actually able to kill my to put a counter on my Walking Ballista for yet another layer of protection. Also, here we see why my opponent went for the fetch. It's because they wanted to Once Upon a Time, and they find Blighted Agent off of it. So here we attack. Now that my opponent is tapped out, I am actually very incentivized to destroy this Inkmoth Nexus right here. My opponent has no way to give haste to their threats, so the only way that I can get attack next turn is with this Inkmoth. So knowing that my opponent is tapped out basically guarantees that I cannot die next turn because I cannot get attacked. So now I do float my mana. I can even tap the Ghost Quarter here because again I'm going to Ghost Quarter this right now, so it's safe for me to tap this Ghost Quarter because I know that this Ghost Quarter is going to resolve. Elvish Spirit Guide is not a legal card in Modern. So we put a counter on the Ballista. We're going to main phase Ghost Quarter my opponent's Inkmoth Nexus. And then we're going to bounce. It doesn't really matter why. I chose to bounce the Gemstone Mine. It doesn't really matter. At this point, I'm feeling like I cannot lose this game anymore. So we attack for 7 and note something. My opponent's going to untap now, and they're going to play an Inkmoth Nexus. I don't know whether this... It could be very, very true that this is my opponent's draw step. But if this were not my opponent's draw step and they were waiting on me to use the Ghost Quarter before playing out the Inkmoth Nexus, then our line was even better. Then it was by far the best possible line, because if they had access to the Inkmoth Nexus on the previous turn and I had gone for Ghost Quartering the Inkmoth Nexus while it was free, right, on my turn, while my opponent only had a single green mana up, that was like the only window that I had where it was basically guaranteed for the Inkmoth to die. And if they had played a second Inkmoth on the previous turn, then I would have actually died to the Inkmoth plus protection, because the only layer of protection that I would have had would have been the Walking Ballista. So by choosing to play it slow and to know which cards we're dying to and how to play around those cards in the best possible way, we were able to turn a potentially lost game into a win. And note that my opponent actually had the second Blighted Agent. They were also sandbagging the other Blighted Agent. Like either this was their draw step or this was their draw step. So whatever it is, it doesn't matter. The truth is that by playing in the fashion that we did and forcing my opponent to not use their mana because they needed to hold up interaction, we were able to basically overpower that interaction and basically out-tempo our opponent, right? Like my opponent spent multiple turns where they didn't get to use their mana because they needed to hold it up for protection. Because I played the game slow, I held up my Ghost Quarter activation until the first situation where it was guaranteed to do the most damage, and I used my, I guess not my life total, but my Infect life total as a resource in order to make sure that I can maximize each one of my cards, both the Walking Ballista and the Ghost Quarter, in order to make sure that I can win an otherwise very, very unfavorable matchup for us. So at this point, my opponent plays the second explosive. I top deck the engineer explosives. The second Blighted Agent, I meant. Sorry, I top deck the engineer explosives anyway. So this basically makes this easy mode because I can play around any kind of protection spell / pump spell. So whenever I put the engineered explosives on the stack, my opponent immediately concedes the game. But I think it's very easy. In fact, again, like people in chat were asking me why I wasn't doing this, and they were suggesting that I do it. And I think that I we only won this game because of how patient I was, and how I always had the same question in my mind, which is how can I lose from here, right? There's always no need that for you to be the first one to interact against Infect, unless your opponent is just like attacking you for lethal, or you know that you cannot play around anything. So if you're able to hold up some kind of interaction, it's very often the best decision for you to make sure that you hold it up for as long as possible, because it puts your opponent behind on tempo. They will end turns with multiple unused mana, and that is exactly the game that you want to be playing, because of course we have so much more mana than they do, thanks to like, well, our deck being a ramp style deck. So we have so much more mana than they do, and our cards are much more impactful. So by sequencing and by playing in the way that we did, we were able to secure a win against what is out of all the higher tier decks, which is what is by far our worst matchup. So thank you so much for watching this. Hopefully this was useful and you learned something about how to approach the Infect menace, which has actually seen a serious uptick in the recent times. If you enjoy this type of content, of course, make sure that you leave a message in the comments, and yeah, like, subscribe, all the good stuff, and I will see you in the next video. Thank you so much for checking it out. Have a good day. Bye bye.